Our guest this week on Veterans Chronicles is Clint Hill, a veteran of the U.S. Army and for nearly 2 decades, a Secret Service agent who protected 5 presidents and their families from Dwight D. Eisenhower through Gerald Ford. In 2016, he authored the book, 5 Presidents, My Extraordinary Journey with Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and Ford. Mr. Hill, it's an honor to have you with us. Thank you.
It's a pleasure being here. Thank you.
Where were you born and raised?
I was born and raised up in North Dakota.
When did you join the service?
Immediately out of college. I graduated from college in the end of May 1954, and I immediately, within a month, I was in the Army.
Where'd you go to college?
Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota.
Okay. And you joined the Army, obviously, but why? Why'd you pick the Army?
I didn't have a choice. I was
drafted. Okay.
I went through the draft procedure, and they shipped me to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri.
What kind of training did you do there?
Well, I just had the basic training there, and then they transferred me to the Army Intelligence Center Training Center in Dundalk, Maryland, and it was called Fort Holabird.
Okay. And what did they have you doing there?
There I went through a training program for a number of months and became a special agent in counterintelligence.
What can you tell us about that?
Well, the training program we went to was extremely thorough, and it was probably the best training system I'd ever seen. And I look back on it even today and say that, boy, a lot of other organizations could learn from it. We did a great many things. We ran background investigations, full field investigations on people who were being considered for top secret clearance or members of the cabinet and things of that nature. We also ran surveillance on certain people because we were concerned about their having certain information and maybe they were being not too careful and they were jeopardizing the security. And we were responsible for securing certain installations where we were manufacturing certain products that they didn't want anybody to know were being manufactured, like nerve gas.
So we're in the mid-1950s at this point. The concern over communism is very, very high, and so I'm sure that's factoring into the crucial work that you're doing.
That's exactly what it was all about, was countering the Soviet Union and the agents in the Soviet Union, making sure that our facilities that were involved in certain manufacturing products were not jeopardized.
So from the time you spent doing that work, did you find people who weren't careful or even people who perhaps weren't necessarily as loyal as they should be? Some,
but not very many. I mean, people were pretty honest and upright and really hard workers. And so we were very fortunate in that regard, but we were kept busy. There's no question about that.
How much did you enjoy that work?
That's what brought me into the Secret Service, because I was originally going to teach history and coach athletics. That was my goal when I went to college. But when I got into I was in the Counterintelligence Corps and operated doing all this investigative work and surveillance and things of that nature, which I really enjoyed. I decided that I re-enlisted actually after the second year. I extended my enlistment for another year. And then when I did get out, I immediately applied to another agency in government that was very small. It was the U.S. Secret Service, in which there were only at that time 269 agents. So there were no vacancies. And I had to wait to get in for about 6 months or 8 months. And during that time, I was a detective for the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad.
Okay. What appealed to you about the Secret Service while you were doing the counterintelligence work?
Well, I had some experience with them because in 1955 I was stationed in Denver, Colorado. And President Eisenhower came out there and he had a heart attack and he was confined to Fitzsimmons Army Hospital. And the Secret Service was out there working, and we had some work out there too, and so we got to know each other a little bit. And I was very impressed by the agents that I met, and they talked to me about some of the things they did, and it was very interesting. So I did look into it, and that's what I decided to do.
So after you waited for several months, what did they have you do once they said, yes, come on board?
Well, that was kind of funny because the day I was sworn in, I was given a pistol, a handgun, ammunition. I was given a badge, handcuffs. I was taken over to the U.S. Mint in Denver to see if I could qualify with the handgun, which I did. Within 2 days, I was on a security detail assisting Mrs. Eisenhower's mother, who lived in Denver, Colorado. At the request of the president, we were required to spend the nights in her home from 7 at night until 7 in the morning to make sure that she was okay. And during that time, we got to know Mrs. Eisenhower and the president and all the family because they'd come and visit her, and we were there. And during that long night, why Mrs. Eisenhower would make us sandwiches and all kinds of things. So we got to have a rather close relationship with the family.
Does that help explain how you got on his detail so quickly?
No, because I got on his detail within a year because the way I came into the Secret Service, I was a Schedule C appointee, and that required that within 1 year I'd be assigned to the White House.
Okay.
And so I was sent back initially after I'd been in about 6 or 7 months for a 30-day evaluation period. All of the agents were at a certain time, and that was when they determined whether or not we were suitable for that kind of an assignment.
What kind of a learning curve is there in joining a presidential detail?
Well, it's pretty intense, so you really have to be on your toes and be up to snuff on everything, learning a lot of people and who they are and how best to function in the way that the Secret Service wants you to function, and taking into consideration the personality of the person that you're protecting.
Is there a substantial number of threats to the president at that time compared to now?
With President Eisenhower, not too many.
Okay.
He was so popular worldwide that he had some threats, but they were minimal.
And you stayed friends with them after they left the White House?
Well, to the point that when I retired from the Secret Service in 1975, the Secret Service threw a big retirement party about 2 months after I retired. And Mrs. Eisenhower was one of those people who took the time to come to it. She drove down after the agents that were working with her drove her down from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, to attend the retirement party in Washington, D.C.
Quite a tribute.
Yeah, it really was.
1960 election, of course, comes. That's Nixon versus Kennedy. Were you involved with protection on the campaign, or were you still with the Eisenhowers at that point?
I was with Eisenhower right up through the election day and the day after. The day after the election, President Eisenhower decided he wanted to go to Augusta, Georgia to play golf. And so we went down to Augusta. And after the first round of golf, my senior supervisor called me aside and informed me that I was to return to Washington, D.C. The Secretary of Defense was down there briefing, and he was going to fly back on his plane that night. I was to fly back with him and go in to see the head of the Secret Service the next morning. And they never explained why. And it was rather curious on my part. I couldn't understand why I was being sent back to Washington and had to go and see the director. At that time, they was called the chief. I really thought maybe I was going to be fired and I'd done something wrong. I really didn't know.
And they told you?
That I went in to see him, and after about a 90-minute interview with his deputy, and 3 inspectors, they finally told me that I was being reassigned to Mrs. John F. Kennedy.
Had you ever met her?
Never had met her. Didn't want the assignment because I knew how the agents who had been with Mamie Eisenhower and Bess Truman, they did things that like go to fashion shows and tea parties and watch canasta games. That's not my idea of what I wanted to do. I wanted to be where the action was, and that was always, up to that point, with the president.
Did your view of the job change once you met her?
Not immediately, but because really she didn't want me there. I didn't want to be there. She didn't want somebody looking over her shoulder 24 hours a day. But she knew she didn't have any choice, and I didn't have any choice. So we agreed to get along, and we did. And after about 4 or 5 months, I realized this was really a pretty good job because she was very active. We traveled a lot, and the president was always checking with me to make sure everything was okay. So it was a much better job than I had originally anticipated.
Were you the only agent assigned to her?
There were 2 of us. 2 of us assigned to Mrs. Kennedy and 3 other agents assigned to the children.
How much do you see you must see a lot of the family's personal life when you're around? What was the Kennedy family like in private?
Well, they were a wonderful family. The president loved those children and his wife, and she was really devoted to her husband. She used to have set up little dinner parties in the White House so that the president could get away from the Oval Office for a couple hours in the evening, a couple times a week, and that she'd have people in that he could really relax in front of. They had a wonderful relationship, and they had a regular schedule. They would spend 4th of July, Labor Day, and Thanksgiving up on Cape Cod. They had a place in Hyannisport, and then we would spend Christmas, New Year's, and Easter down in Palm Beach, Florida. And then they had leased a property out in Middleburg, Virginia, in the middle of Virginia hunt country, because Mrs. Kennedy loved to ride horses. And that was within a 30-minute helicopter ride from the White House for the president. And that was their reason for renting that property, so that she could go out there with the children, and he could come out on weekends and spend some time there. And it worked out very well. I tried to convince her that they ought to try Camp David. But the president and she were very hesitant, because it was a government facility. It was going to cost the government money. He was very, very conscious of spending any of the government's money. When we traveled, Mrs. Kennedy never flew on government transportation, except maybe 2 or 3 times. They had their own private plane, the Caroline. And if we went internationally, we went commercial.
Sir, let's talk about November 22nd, 1963. Had there been any concern about open cars? I remember there had been some concern. Even the president himself had said at times that there was some vulnerability there. Was the Secret Service concerned about that much?
No, we were very concerned about it, but we knew we didn't have much of a choice. In this particular instance, going into Texas, the reason for the trip was maximum visibility and maximum exposure for President and Mrs. Kennedy, because they wanted as many people to be up close and personal to them as they possibly could get. And so that was the purpose of the trip. That meant open cars no matter where we went. They asked, the agents were instructed to back off as much as possible. There were times when I got up very, very close, but it was because of the situation that developed. Under normal circumstances, we tried to stay as far away as we could to make them feel like that they were just among their friends and people along the side of the street, and wanted the people inside the street to feel like there was no barrier between them and the President and Mrs. Kennedy.
So it was the president and his wife and Governor Connolly and his wife in that car. Where were you and how far away?
That was the presidential car. I was in the immediate car behind him, the follow-up car, which we ran between about 3 to 5 feet between the two cars at all times, no matter what the speed. I was on the left-hand side of the running board of that car. That was also an open car. There were 8 agents in that car and 2 members of President Kennedy's staff. Kenny O'Donnell, his chief of staff, and Dave Powers, his chief personal assistant. I was on the left side of the car on the running board, and as we went through an area called Dealey Plaza, I was scanning the area. It was just a grassy area, and the crowd, which had been very large as we traveled through Dallas, had dropped off as we approached Dealey Plaza. It was the end of the motorcade, pretty much. We were going to get on an expressway to take the president to a speech site called the Trade Mart. And there was an overpass we were going to have to go under, and I was looking at that, and I noticed there was some police on top. That was good enough for me. And we noticed, though, as we traveled down the streets of Dallas, that the windows were open on buildings, and people were on fire escapes or on top of buildings, any place they could be to get a better view of the motorcade. And the same was true of the building we passed on the corner of Houston and Elm Street. It was called the Texas School Book Depository. We saw that there were about 4 or 5 windows open in that building, and there were some workmen sitting on a ledge, apparently having lunch, taking a lunch break, watching the motorcade as we approached. And we had turned down on Elm Street, maybe 150 feet, and as I was scanning to my left, I heard this explosive noise from the rear over my right shoulder. I didn't recognize it as a gunshot initially, so I started to turn toward that noise, and I only got as far as the back of the president's car, because I saw the president's reaction, and that's when I realized it had been a gunshot. He grabbed at his throat, and he started to fall to his left. He had a back brace on, which prevented him from really bending much forward, But also, immediately in front of him was seated Governor Connolly in a jump seat, and the back of that jump seat was almost up against the knees of President Kennedy. So he started to fall to his left, and when I then realized this was a gunshot, so I jumped from my position and I ran toward the presidential car with the intent of getting up on top of the back to provide a shield there for President and Mrs. Kennedy. Now, when I ran, I had to go between a motorcycle officer on his motorcycle and the car I was on. There was engine noise, and they told me later there was a second shot at that time, but I never heard that shot. And as I approached the car, just as I was getting there was another shot that was fired. That one I heard and I felt, because at that time the president had fallen a little bit farther to his left, and his head was way down, kind of like this. And that shot hit him in the back of the head, and then it erupted out of the upper right quadrant, just above the ear. And it blew that portion of the skull, which was still attached to the scalp, forward like a flap, kind of. And out of that wound gushed blood and bone fragments and brain matter all over the back of the car, all over me, all over Mrs. Kennedy. When I started to get up in the car, Mrs. Kennedy came up in the trunk. She was trying to grab some of that material that had erupted out of the president's head, and she managed to get some of it in her hand. I grabbed her and put her in the back seat. When I did that, the president's body fell to his left into her lap. The right side of his face was up. I could see his eyes were fixed. There was a hole in the skull. I could see in that hole there was no brain matter left. It had all been blown out. I assumed he had passed. He was dead. So I turned and gave a thumbs down to the other agents on the car behind, because they hadn't had a chance to react like I did, because they turned toward the noise too for guys on the other side of the car, which meant they turned away from the president just at the moment that he was going to be shot. By the time they turned back, I was already at the car. It was too late for them. They couldn't do anything.
What was your immediate reaction then? And was it you that gave the order to go to the hospital?
Well, I screamed at the driver to get to the hospital, but the agent in the right front seat, he told the driver to hit it, get out of there, because that was what we were supposed to evacuate the area. And so we were not familiar with Dallas at all. And so the chief of police, Chief Curry, got in front of us in his car, and he led us to Parkland Hospital.
How long of a drive is that?
It took us about 4 minutes to get there, and we were running above 70 miles an hour as we traveled down this Stemmons Freeway. And I was lying up on back of the back seat. I kind of wedged myself in between the two sides of the car so I wouldn't slide off, because we had to make some turns, and it was a little precarious at a couple of points.
What's happening in the car at this time? What are the other people doing?
Nobody is saying anything. At first, Mrs. Kennedy made some comments. She said, "Oh, Jack, what have they done? They've shot his head off. I have his brains in my hand. I love you, Jack." And that was all she said. And then we raced to the hospital. When we got to the hospital, they had been alerted that we were coming by the chief of police. But there was nobody there outside to meet us at all, so the agent in the lead car jumped out, ran in. He found that there was a tenant trying to bring out two gurneys at the same time. They got caught in the doorway and couldn't do it. So he grabbed one of the gurneys and brought it out. But we had to remove the governor from the car before we could do anything for the president because of the way the car was configured. So we got the governor up, rushed him into the emergency room. Then we were going to work and help the president get out, just take the president, put him on a gurney, but Mrs. Kennedy had a hold of him and she wouldn't let go. So I pleaded with her. I said, "Please, Mrs. Kennedy, let us help the president." And never got no response at all. So then I thought to myself, I know what's wrong. I've been with her over 3 years now. I know her pretty well. She didn't want anybody to see the condition he's in. And so I took off my suit coat and I covered up his head and his upper back. As soon as I did that, she let go. We lifted him up, put him on a gurney, ran into the emergency room, put him in trauma room 1.
And then you waited with her?
Yeah, I waited in there. My assistant stayed immediately beside her. My supervisor asked me to open a phone line to the White House in Washington. And so I was briefing my supervisor in Washington about what had happened. And the operator cut in. And he said, "Mr. Hill, the Attorney General wants to talk to you." So the Attorney General was Robert Kennedy, the President's brother. He said, Clint, he said, what's going on down there? So I explained to him that there had been a shooting. The president had been hit. Governor Connolly had been hit. We were in the hospital. They were doing what they could to try and help the two gentlemen. He said, well, how bad is it? Now, I didn't want to tell Robert Kennedy that his brother was dead. So I just said, it's as bad as it can get. And with that, he just hung up the phone. So then at 1 o'clock, the doctor came out of the trauma room and said, I'm sorry, but the president is dead. There's nothing more we can do. When that happened, the chief of staff came to me and said, Clint, we want to transport the president's body back to Washington. Can you arrange to get us a casket? So I ordered a casket and had it brought to the hospital, brought in, and they were preparing the president's body to be placed in the casket when one of the coroners came in. And he said, what are you guys doing? And we said, we're preparing to transport the body back to Washington. He said, you can't leave the hospital. We said, why not? He said, because there's a law in Texas that says that a homicide victim has to be autopsied before he's released. And we said, well, how long will that take? And they said, oh, an hour, maybe 2 hours, maybe a day. And we said, no, that's not acceptable. So then they agreed to allow us to take the president's body, provided we would provide a medical doctor with the body through the entire process. And so I volunteered Admiral George Berkeley, who was the president's military physician and happened to be there. And so he remained with the body right up through the autopsy.
The shooting was about 12:30 Dallas time, right?
Well, it's roughly 12:30 in the afternoon.
So the trauma physicians really only had a few minutes before they realized there was nothing they could do.
They realized almost instantly that nothing they could do. They didn't even turn the president's body over. They didn't realize that there were two gunshot holes in the back, one at about the neck level and the other one low in the back of the head that had exited above the ear. The one above the ear is the one that they saw immediately. No brain matter there. His eyes is fixed. He was breathing a little bit at the time that we got him into the emergency room. I guess it was just an involuntary situation, but that didn't last long, and there was no blood pressure and nothing.
Did you accompany Mrs. Kennedy on the flight back?
Yes, I did. When we got the permission to remove the body and took the casket out to the ambulance that we had there, I suggested to Mrs. Kennedy that we ride in the car, and she said, no, I'm going to ride in the back with the president. I said, okay. So we opened the door, and she got in, and I got in with her. And so there we were, three of us with the casket in the back of the hearse. And we got to Love Field, and then the agents that I was working with, we all carried the casket up the stairs to the rear door of Air Force One. And we then prepared to leave, but Vice President and Mrs. Johnson were also on board. And he had been conferring with Washington and had received instructions that he should be sworn in while we were still on the ground in Dallas. And that required a federal judge. So we finally found Sarah Hughes, who had just been appointed a federal judge, brought her on board, and she was going to swear the then vice president in to be president. And just before that happened, I was in the forward portion of Air Force One. Mrs. Kennedy was back by the casket, and she sent word that she wanted to see me. She stood up and she grabbed my hand and she said, oh, Mr. Hill, she said, what's going to happen to you now? I said, I'll be okay, Mrs. Kennedy, I'll be okay. She was concerned about myself and about the other agents, about how we were reacting, because she knew how much we thought of the president. So then when that was over, they began the swearing-in ceremony, and she agreed to stand right next to Vice President Johnson as he took the oath of office for President of the United States.
Still wearing the same clothes?
She wouldn't take off her clothes. She said she wanted the people to see what had been done.
It's amazing testimony that she would be concerned about you at that moment.
I know, it was shocking to me that she would be.
Obviously, the next few days would create even more upheaval with the murder of Oswald and the incredible funeral for the president, I believe, the day following that.
Well, the day after, we brought the casket to the White House, and it lay there in the White House through the 23rd until the 24th, and then we had to move it to the U.S. Capitol, place it in state there on the 24th, and there were so many people who wanted to see it that they had allow people to pass by it all day and all night that night. And then we went back on the 25th, and that was the day of the official funeral. Brought the body out of the rotunda of the Capitol, put on the cortege, and went back to the White House. When we got to the White House, we met about 110 or so visiting heads of state, heads of government, like Charles de Gaulle and Haile Selassie, King Baudouin of Belgium, the Queen of the Netherlands, and I mean, there were just so many heads of state there. And then Mrs. Kennedy decided to walk from that point to St. Matthew's Cathedral, and because she walked, all these heads of state walked, which created an absolute security nightmare for everybody as we walked up Pennsylvania Avenue to St. Matthew's Cathedral.
Was Mrs. Kennedy aware? Did she have any reaction to the murder of Oswald at the time?
She didn't find out about it because of how it happened. It happened on the 24th, just about the time we were taking the body out of the White House to put it on the cortege to take it to the Capitol. So she didn't know about it until at least later that day. But insofar as I never heard any reaction from her whatsoever.
Do you think if Oswald hadn't been murdered, that the conspiracies would not have arisen in the way that they did?
Oh, that's the case. The fact that he was murdered, the fact that we could not interrogate him and find out his motive and exactly why he did this, has created all the room for conspiracies of all kinds. And there's a new one every day. And I hear them all. And the one thing about it is they all are theories. They're not fact at all. And you can discount all of them. And I have.
What was her reaction to the theories as they arose over the years?
She tried to avoid it. She really did try to avoid all the information that was coming out about the assassination. She had to testify. The Warren Commission people actually came to the house. I stayed with her for a year after the assassination at the request of the President and Congress. And that whole year she tried to avoid that subject as much as possible.
How did you see her evolve over that year?
Well, she was in shock at first, then she was in mourning. She stood up pretty well, I mean, when she had to in public. But when she was in private, she was really very depressed, and she just couldn't understand why. And then with the two children, the fact that on the day of the funeral, the 25th of November, that also was John Jr.'s birthday. He was 3 years old that day. And then 2 days later was Caroline's birthday. And then we went through Thanksgiving. We went up to Hyannisport so Mrs. Kennedy could talk to the President's parents. We came back. We were still at the White House. President Johnson allowed she and the children to stay there until December 6th. And then we moved them out to Georgetown. And then we had to go to Florida for the Christmas season, and that was terrible because here the two children were without a father, and it was just really depressing.
We only have a couple minutes left, sir, so after that year, you were back on presidential detail. How different was it, how did Secret Service change things around as a result of the assassination?
Well, the reorganization of the service started right after when the Warren Commission came out in 1964, when the report was given to the President. I came back from Mrs. Kennedy a couple days after the election in November of 1964 and was assigned to President Johnson. And a lot of things changed. We no longer used open cars. We acquired a armored vehicle that the only one that was available. There was one being used by the FBI for J. Edgar Hoover, and so we used that car, took it away from Hoover. He didn't think too much of that, but it was necessary. And that was one major change. And then they began to increase the numbers of agents within the service, change the training programs completely. And so everything was really starting to evolve. Yeah, beginning about September of 1964. I remember in 1967, I think we had the largest influx of new agents that year that we had ever had.
You served all the way up to 1975. President Ford was president. I believe that's
Correct.
The same year there were 2 attempts on his life. Were you already retired by then, or were you still with him?
They happened 1 month after I retired. Okay. And I was away. I was up in North Dakota, my home state. And as soon as my sister told me what had happened, because I was out in the fields working, came back, she told me I tried to get hold of somebody who would tell me what exactly happened, and I had lost my security clearance because I retired, and they wouldn't tell me. And so I was really frustrated.
This is subjective, and maybe you can't say, but of the 5 presidents and families that you dealt with, I'm not going to say ask who you liked or disliked, but who was the easiest to work with and who was the most difficult to work with?
Eisenhower is probably the easiest to work with. Eisenhower maybe, yeah, more so than Ford, but Ford was fairly easy too. But Eisenhower was the easiest. Probably Nixon was the hardest.
Personality-wise or demands-wise? Or?
Mostly personality-wise, because it was very difficult to work with he and the staff that he had. Some of the things that he wanted to do that really weren't in his own best interest.
When you think back to this and just the monumental story that this has been, I'm sure there were thoughts going through your head over the years about what could have been done differently, either preparation-wise or reacting in the moment. Is there anything that, after thinking through it for 50-plus years, that really could have changed anything?
Well, if we had had an armored car, that would have
Sure.
changed completely. And if we would have had manpower to ensure that no buildings had windows open, so no people were on top of buildings, no people were on fire escapes. But that had been going on for years, no matter where we were, in the United States or in Europe, Southeast Asia, it didn't matter. It was always the same. There were just people all over the place. It's very hard to really manage that many people, and a lot of it depends on luck, actually. A lot of planning, but a lot of luck, too.
Mr. Hill, thank you for your service to our nation in so many different capacities, Secret Service as well as the U.S. Army. Thanks very much for your time today also.
Well, thank you. It's really been a pleasure being here.
Thank you. Clint Hill, veteran of the U.S. Army, and for nearly 2 decades, a U.S. Secret Service agent in the detail of 5 different presidencies. I'm Greg Corombos. This is Veterans Chronicles.